Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and we spill the tea. And today, we're starting a very special series. We are hearkening back to last year when we started a retrospective about one of the most important rock bands in the history of modern music. We talked about Radiohead, and in each video, we discussed one album, we detailed their career, provided some context, and went deep into the lore and our feelings and shit, and it was cool. So, naturally, this was a cool idea. We had fun time doing it. We wanted to do it with more artists, and honestly, what better artist to continue it with than someone as idiosyncratic but nonetheless omnipresent in the world of music than Björk.
Indeed. And there's a connection here as well, because obviously Björk is an artist who had a profound influence on Radiohead around the era of Kid A as well, for reasons that we'll get into. But also, I think Björk is a good artist to do a retrospective on because each of her albums has its own unique identity. And in a lot of cases, like comes with its own kind of like moment within sort of musical culture as well. Like she's remained influential, she's remained present. She hasn't exactly had hits since the 90s, but she has been a figure that is so recognizable that's kind of transcended music to just be kind of like a fixture of popular culture as well. And we'll talk about the ways in which she has done that as we progress through her career. Like with Radiohead, this is not just going to be a discussion of reviewing all 9 Björk albums. We're going to discuss the story of Björk. We're going to discuss how each record represents a change in her momentum, the things that influence each record, the things that influence Björk, and the ways in which her status within the culture shifts and changes as her sound changes as time goes on. We'll discuss the influence of her extended career outside of music as well. When we get into the 2000s, we can talk about the influence of her acting in Lars von Trier's film Dance from the Dark would have had on what she was, on her cultural presence and the things that she was doing at that time as well. It's not going to be an exhaustive discussion of every single piece of music that Björk has released. We're just going to stick to the core 9 studio records. I believe that it's 9. I think that's right.
I think you are correct. She does have a number of live albums and just like live performances of like a lot of each individual records, but I think that those are kind of an entirely separate, like Björk is a very interesting artist, a very multifaceted and multimedia artist, and puts a lot of work into like visuals in some of her live stuff. So focusing on the music, I feel kind of really focuses on the core of her. It sort of ekes into everything else about her, but know that she is more than just what we are immediately discussing. And I think it's also good that it's just the two of us here to discuss an album that I think by Björk's standards, beginning this little bit of a journey. I know we're going to set some context beforehand, but it's good that I think the two of us are doing this episode because it's comparatively the most simple album, I think, to discuss in general terms.
And I think that in many ways, like obviously this album is very purposefully titled Debut. It is a new beginning for Björk, but I think we would be remiss to ignore the fact that this was not Björk's introduction to the world of making music.
New beginning, exactly. There was a beginning before this.
Björk, who was born Björk Gudmundsdottir, was essentially a child prodigy, or at least she entered the world of music from a very young age. Of course, grew up, born, raised, lived, representative of Iceland. And so she released music as a child. In fact, her first album came out in, I think, 1977. It was a self-titled record, which mostly comprised covers. I think the most notable being there's a cover of the Beatles' Fall on the Hill on there, and a bunch of other songs as well, some of which I think are sort of Icelandic staples. I haven't heard the record in full, but I've kind of dipped in and out of it. And I think it's fair to say I understand why Björk has kind of distanced herself from it. It's very much a relic. I mean, she recorded it when she was 12 years old, for Christ's sake.
It's like, not hers.
Yeah, exactly. It is. but it's an example of her entering the world of music. And then she entered the world of music more impactfully in the 80s as the frontwoman of the very popular and beloved rock band, the Sugarcubes, which had quite an impact and influence during their tenure. I mean, they formed, I think, in the mid 80s, and then they had their biggest hits around the late 80s. Their first album, Life's Too Good, which came out in 1988, had a number of really big singles on it, including the song Birthday. Made a really big name for the band, but particularly for Björk herself as this presence. And the first thing you notice about Björk when you listen to any of her music is how powerful she is as a vocal presence. She has, I mean, not only one of the most unique voices in all of popular music, but such a compelling and huge and powerful voice that just commands your attention. She has the ability to just absolutely completely invade your eardrums with her incredible bellowing, like rich sheen of a voice. Like it's just gorgeous and huge and angelic at certain points and powerful, and she uses her voice in very sort of like unconventional ways as well. She's not afraid to turn her gorgeously rich bellow into a kind of snarling rattle as well, and she's able to do that and kind of meld between those styles, like on the flip of a coin. Like she can do it so effortlessly and so easily, and she refined that skill through her music with the Sugarcubes.
I'd compare her voice, vocally speaking, a lot to another art pop giant, that being Kate Bush. When she sort of started pushing the limits of her sound, she started using very different vocal tonalities and very like techniques of involving like whooping and just like being like really shrill and like just generally the antithesis of how pretty and plaintive her normal vocals sounded. So in a sense, it's like she pushed the boundaries of what we kind of see as possible as a vocalist can do, because she's, yes, very traditionally gifted, but also outside of that fact, she's kind of carved her own niche, because nobody, I think even to this day, no matter how unique of a voice they have, doesn't ever take it quite as far as Björk takes it, even as early as this record.
Absolutely. And Björk, I think once the Sugarcubes dissolved in the early 90s, Björk expressed a desire to move away from rock music, which she described, I don't have the exact quote here, but I believe she described a lot of what was happening in popular rock music as stagnant, uninteresting to her. And she believed the cutting edge of music to be in the electronic and techno scene that was happening in the UK in the late 80s and the early 90s. She gravitated heavily towards that, to the extent that she moved to London specifically to start her solo career in this environment where techno and house music and electronic music of all stripes was having its big moment, was the cultural fixture in the club scene in particular. And the biggest way in which she kind of cemented this direction was her collaboration with the producer Nellie Hooper, who at the time was known for working with Massive Attack, who produced Sinead O'Connor's Nothing Compares to You, I think, as well, worked with a variety of artists. Would go on to work with the Smashing Pumpkins and No Doubt and Madonna and U2 and all sorts of things, but was at this particular junction in time a figure who was able to guide Björk into how to integrate these really cutting edge electronic and techno sounds that were so huge in the early 90s at this particular period. And this interest of Björk's is obviously something that will get more and more sort of profound and focused and innovative as this decade goes on, and we'll get to that with subsequent records. But one of the things that you are struck with, I think, when you listen to Debut for the first time is just how like solidly ingrained it is within this very specific scene and time. In some ways, it is the most dated of Björk's records because it very clearly bears the influence of certain sonic textures that are super early 90s. But also by the same stroke, she's often using these textures, which are very of their time, very related to the specific scene, and kind of combining and throwing them together in ways that are really original and really strange and new. And her compositions and song constructions are quite unusual. I mean, you consider the first 3 songs on this record, which I think is the inarguable peak of the album.
Oh, 100% agree.
And I think if you're interested in Björk and you don't want to listen to the whole record, you at least have to listen to the first 3 songs on it. Human Behavior, Crying, and Venus is a Boy. I think Human Behavior is maybe the best of the 3, in my opinion. It is like a song that immediately introduces to you who Björk is going to be as a presence. The opening lyric of the album, which is, if you ever get close to a human and human behavior, be ready to get confused. Like that to me is such a like welcome to the world of Björk, because she's described so often as this kind of like alien figure, right? As this kind of, you know, force that's beamed in, that is sort of something that's so like beyond typical human beings and typical singers. And so the way
influence on Tom York is also just immediately apparent. You're like, oh, I get it.
Yeah, 100%. And so like the combination of these electronics textures and very UK techno sounds that she's playing around with, but she's throwing together so bizarrely on these first few songs, particularly Human Behavior and Crying, like that automatically catches you off guard. And I feel like I have some level of, I guess, qualification to speak on this, because this is the sort of music I grew up with. My dad was heavily into like UK sort of electronic and techno and acid house and all these sorts of musical scenes that were kind of exploding in the early 90s. And my dad has a CD copy of Debut, and I remember listening to it in the car at a very young age. Like Björk has been a fixture in my life since I was very, very small. And so when I listened to Debut, the textures and sounds of this record sound very familiar to me, but I appreciate now, I think more than I ever have before, just how actually unique the album is, how actually strange and unconventional the album is. I think Crying is a good example as well. I mean, this is, lyrically, of course, it's a beautiful and emotional song that, again, shows you just how much Björk is comfortable putting herself and how deeply and strongly she feels into her music, such that, you know, particularly in this early era, you know, the general conceptions that she's this weird alien figure, I think, fall apart when you see how actually human and like emotive and connective to the listener she actually tries to be. But yeah, this is a song, I think, that has collisions of textures and deployments of sounds that are so unique and striking, while adhering to fundamental like core aspects of dance music, like 4 on the floor beats and sort of like just standard construction. But she's just taking like textures and doing conventional things with them, but kind of putting them together in a way that feels like really interesting, I think. And it doesn't always work, but I think that it's always compelling and it's always interesting. And you get the feeling that Björk, even with this record where she's trying to redefine herself, has a restlessness to her, such that I would say no 2 songs on this album really sound that alike. There is a distinct quality and character to each track on this record that really makes it doubly impressive, I think.
My history with Björk is obviously not as extensive. If you pay attention to the main podcast series, you'll know that I've mentioned a couple of her albums in my What We've Been Listening To segments. But over the course of the past year, very specifically, I listened to a lot of her classic records when I first became entrenched in the world of music. But I've become just sort of like, before I kind of appreciated it at a distance, but now that I'm a bit more musically literate, I consider myself a fully fledged convert super fan of her work now, for many different reasons. And I think the interesting about Debut in particular is this is the album that most people, maybe you'll get a couple people that'll say that you should start with Post, but this is usually the album people go to say like, hey, if you're not familiar with Björk, or if you want to get into like art pop or something, you know, Debut, good album to like get you into it, because that's like the most comparatively normal Björk album, which I understand that designation, but I also think it downplays how like aggressively idiosyncratic this is, because this is not simply just like an art pop album. I think that the biggest thing is that you have a big appreciation for like the house and like techno and acid parts of her sound that are undeniably there. Whereas, I don't really have that background. So the first influence that jumped out at me with Björk on very much this album in particular is Madonna. I hear every era of that woman's sound all over this, especially in like the very heavy techno beats. That was what Madonna was getting into at about the exact same time when she was trying to really synthesize some of her more adventurous pop stuff. And even the tonality of her vocals occasionally kind of scrapes up against that. But it presents a level of accessibility that I do think is the reason why this is most commonly cited as an entry level Bjork album. But simultaneously, this is also, I think, considered to be a lot of people's like in the pantheon of their favorites of her records. And while I definitely do not agree with that statement, I think it's undeniable that I think she just builds on what exactly this album does in basically what I would deem empirically better ways in later albums, as immediate as something like Post, in my opinion. But that's not to say that there isn't a whole lot to appreciate here. I completely agree with you that the first three songs are kind of the peak. Human Behavior, Crying, and Venus is a Boy. I love the way the textural drums are on Human Behavior. They sound kind of like reverb heavy, they sound big, but it also makes them sound very distant. It adds a really weird quality to kind of bounciness of that particular song. And Crying is kind of in that same exact vein. It's a little bit more traditionally like where you feel that kind of Madonna or sort of house influence in the sort of beat to it. And Venus as a Boy, I think, is maybe one of the most beloved songs by most people, especially by fans, which goes to show you, I think, a lot of the idiosyncrasies of her writing. Like, yes, she's very emotional, she's very focused on romance and how like histrionic things can be for her, and perceiving the world as this very, very emotionally intuitive and simultaneously like a lack of emotional intuitiveness that creates a manic quality in some of her vocal deliveries. But it also the way she's willing to bend traditional romance like dynamics and the way that she personally views her love interest, like in something on Venus is a Boy. So you immediately get why something like this might have seemed sort of groundbreaking, is because she immediately, she's got that voice of like just the quality of her accent speaking English words is almost enough to make it like immediately, like if you're untrained to her music, you immediately hear that and you're like, whoa, this sounds like I've never heard anybody sing like this before. And it might take a little bit of a bit to like, jump over that bit of a hurdle, but I think that's, definitely a feature, not a bug. But these three songs blend the instrumental qualities, I think, at their unarguable, most synergistic ways. That said, I really admire and appreciate how out of the gate, this album, just comes out swinging and is just really, really, you can tell that she has so much musical experience, that she, this prodigious talent. It's just like she immediately comes out being who she wants to be and doing what she wants to do. It's just this is the first attempt at exploration. That said, I also think that, yeah, this is probably the most dated album that she's got, and technological limitations certainly, like, you kind of get the impression that maybe she was a little bit further ahead than the technology at the time was, as some of the songs here, for lack of a better word, sound very keyboard preset-y. I
Efficiency, I
wouldn't
would say,
necessarily
yeah,
even say that like
kitschy.
it's, yeah, I wouldn't even necessarily say that like it's an overwhelmingly bad thing. I don't really think it like tanks any of these songs quite as much. I will admit I really am not a fan of the song Big Time Sensuality. I think that's the song that suffers the most from the album's slightly, limited production, and especially sequencing wise. Maybe it's just something that I'm not as accustomed to just because I'm not familiar with a lot of the sounds that she's pulling from here. I'm a little bit more of a mainstreamer in terms of the influences that she's dealing with, but some of the stuff in the back half for me definitely just doesn't quite have that level of creative ingenuity that I feel like those first three tracks managed to maintain, hold on to.
I definitely agree to a certain extent, actually, as well. I think there's some production decisions that don't quite gel with me as well. And to be fair, never really have. I think that the decision to record that beat for There's More to Life Than This in the toilets of a bar, I think. I don't know why she did that. I don't like the way the song sounds. It's kind of it feels a little bit cheap for the sort of, especially for what she's trying to go for in terms of like the richness of sound. Generally speaking, I think another song that suffers for similar reasons is my least favorite on the record, which is Violently Happy, which I like. I used to like a little bit more than I do now. It's just one of the songs where it's one of the more aggressive techno songs on the record, and it just feels like it's one of the ones that suffers the most from its limitations in terms of like
techno type beat. And it's very generic sounding. Like it doesn't even sound dated. It just sounds very, very of its genre, and it doesn't blend in the way that it does other places, at least for me. I don't mind it that much, but I can certainly see why it would turn you off.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. Like, I don't inherently dislike when Bjork goes more aggressive with her techno influences. I think she does it amazingly on Post. But for me,
yes,
the best songs on this record are the songs that are a little more sort of like colorful rather than intense. Like my favorite deep cut on this record is the song Come to Me, which is super soft and sensual and has this sort of like gorgeous tone to it that in a lot of ways predicts a lot of my favorite down-tempo records from the late 90s that I really, really enjoy. Likewise, the Anchor song, I think
those little electronic hits sound like Boards of Canada to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Likewise, I think the Anchor song is a beautiful little closer to the original version of the record, that I like the spearness of it, and I think that she fits well over it. Shout out to the bonus track Play Dead, which was not on the original version of the album, but was one of the singles from the record, and it's always been on my version of the album because I've always like been familiar with it. But it's an absolutely great song. Like it's a highlight. I really love it. It's one of my favorite early Björk singles. And on the note of Big Time Sensuality, because this is a song I have a lot of history with. This, I think, was the first Björk song I ever heard, but it was not the version on this album. And this is kind of something I want to zero in on for a sec. My earliest childhood memory of Björk is this very distinct video for this song, in which it's in black and white, and she's on the back of a truck that's kind of like a truck that you would like stack like a container on or something, except it's got nothing on it, and she's just kind of like standing on it, and she's sort of dancing around as it moves through the city, and she's just like absolutely mugging for the camera, and she's just going absolutely nuts in the way that Björk does. And it's absolutely infectious, and the image you get is this like childlike but also like absolutely animalistic and wild and exciting person who is just so enamored with everything. And the song itself has a beautiful sentiment as well. It's about her excitement about the stage of her career that she's at and about this creative process that she's in the middle of. The problem is that the best version of the song is not the one that's on the album. It is the remix version by the artist Fluke, which is the version of the song that's used in the music video. And I'm familiar with this version of the song, which is this version that I grew up with, which is much, much more spacious and huge sounding. Like the one thing you'll note about Big Time Sensuality, the reason the album version doesn't work, I mean, for one, it is like quite chintzy in terms of the beat and kind of irritating.
Bloopy, for lack of a more nuanced term.
I actually do like the album version. Like, I wouldn't put it in near the bottom of my ranking of the songs on the record, but there is a kind of clash between that sort of I guess brittleness and the vocals themselves, which are so kind of huge and swooping and eerie and like amazing. Like this is one of my favorite songs on the record vocally, because she's just reaching and doing so much melodically with her voice is so amazing.
Got those growls on it too that are just really full of color and personality. That's kind of why I don't like the beat like an extra amount, is that the vocals do sound so big and she's so expressive, and it feels like the claustrophobia of the really kind of tacky beat just kind of limits the song. Yeah. So I'm curious. I really want to hear the other version because I actually haven't heard it.
Absolutely. 100%. I absolutely recommend checking it out because it's good. It's definitely still like an early 90s song, but it sounds a lot better, the Fluke remix, I think. And it really does justice to those vocals, which again, the vocals of the song have been in my life since before I had started primary school. Like I've always known the way that Björk sings, like, it takes courage to enjoy, like the way that she moves her voice around in this song, the way that she goes like
Oblique octaves she hits, she's so fucking good at that. Like,
yeah,
it's so like winding and weird, but really, really natural coming from her.
100%. Like and one of my favorite, maybe my favorite lyric on this record, which is not like a particularly ornate or like, you know, poetic lyric or anything, but just at the bridge of the song when she sings, I don't know my future after this weekend and I don't want to. Like, that's like an exciting line in of itself, but also the way she delivers it as well. She just sounds so like excited and just kind of wondrous. And again, that chorus is so beautiful. It takes courage to enjoy it. The hardcore and the gentle, big time sensuality. Like, it's super joyous and fun. And the single cover is cute as well. She has her hands over her face and she's just like, you can't see her smiling, but you can tell from her eyes that she is. And it's like, everything I love about Björk is there, but it's in the remix, not the album version, which is, you know, it's a shame, but I do enjoy the album version more than you do. It's just definitely the inferior version. Another underrated deep cut I want to shout out that I really like is Airplane.
Airplane. Yeah.
I've always felt this song is underrated, even by Björk fans. It's got a surprisingly kind of complicated sort of structure and arrangement. Like, it's sort of, it throws you off a little bit because it's one of the least sort of pop friendly songs on the record, but it just has this great and really beautiful structure and sense of impact to it as well. I really, really love this track.
The horns on it, I always thought were really like, they're one of the aspects of the production that whenever they do kind of show up, which is admittedly a bit rare, but whenever they do show up, I feel like they accent all of the textures in each of these songs really, really well. It reminds me of a lot, like, you know, the beat notwithstanding, it reminds me of a lot of indie rock. It's very strange. It just kind of goes to show you how much she's pulling from different sources of inspiration while still managing to sort of anchor it into her own thing. Like, even though this is an album that I think is, again, relatively modest when it comes to her, it's incredible how many like just kind of moving parts and the creative wheels that are spinning in her head. It really gives you, like, even thematically, this is an album that I feel like you might listen to initially and dismiss as being a bit monotone, but once you really understand like everything that she's talking about when it comes to love and infatuation and expression and the complicated nature of like human chemistry, I feel like there's something really valuable to understand about the ethos of this album, which is in stark contrast when you have something like, you know, we talked about Radiohead's Pablo Honey, which is an album that many fans barely even consider a Radiohead album, and is just a, you know, it has a bunch of songs and the songs are about some things and sometimes they could be sort of synergistic, but it's overall just kind of a bunch of songs. Whereas this, from the outset, is the polar opposite of something like that, where the idiosyncrasy is turned up to 11 and everything feels thematically together. It's an album that if it was recorded maybe 5 years into the future, it may have aged like almost flawlessly and gracefully, but it is kind of rooted in a bit of an awkward transitional moment in music where the electronic sort of nature of some of her, you know, just some of the songs on here just feel like they could sound better if they were a little bit further along.
I think I want to finish off by talking about a song that we've acknowledged, but we haven't really talked about. And it's fitting that we finish off with this because it was actually one of the last songs recorded for the record. And that is, of course, Venus is a Boy. The most famous song on this record, I think, as you said, and a song also that presages a lot of her lyrical interest and tells you a little bit about the kind of very earthy and deeply fundamental aspects that sexuality and human connection, you know, and just the connection between her and the people in her life, like how much that's going to influence her music going forward, like her relationship with sex and with like her body and herself and intimacy. That's the word I was looking for. Like her the importance of intimacy in her life in various different contexts is something that we will talk about as we go through these records, but it is really laid out to you here on Venus is a Boy, like a song about being just absolutely totally infatuated. And it has this like quite iconic music video as well, where she just kind of like rubs eggs all over her face. and it's like super sexual, but also like quite strange and like weird, and it's just so Björk in like every sense of the word. But the way she opens, like, this is just such a Björk lyric to me.
I love this.
His wicked sense of humor suggests exciting sex. Like
the way she sings it, it sounds like it's not even like weird or like suggestive. It feels playful. It's like, and this is also, in my opinion, the best sounding song on the album. The little chimes that sort of accent the beat here to like it's so pretty. I love the way it sounds, and the strings are distant, but they sound enormous. It feels like you are enveloped in a cocoon of sound on this song, and it's wonderful.
You have like a strange level of like Indian influence as well. Like Björk was super interested in Indian music and sort of like Bollywood at the time, and so she recorded the string arrangements in Bombay, and it has this kind of like sort of Eastern feel to it. But also like lyrically as well, the sentiment not just of, you know, her excitement about her relationship and the intimacy that she's experiencing, but also like there's a sense of like, you know, the song is about how her boyfriend at the time is able to kind of get in touch with a sort of feminine side that she's super attracted to. He's able to kind of deconstruct and be comfortable stepping away from a conventional masculinity, and that makes him more attractive. And so there's this aspect to the fluidity, I guess, of human sexual expression, the fluidity of gender, even the fluidity of relationship dynamics and natures that Björk will lean into more in the future, will explore more in the future. And you have it like forecasted, you have it, the groundwork laid here. And Be Venus is a Boy for that reason, I think, is a song that we're going to refer to reasonably frequently in the future when we discuss certain songs and certain albums, like, you know, Vespertine, for instance, and other ones that I don't want to kind of look ahead to just yet, but we'll come back to it because this is kind of ground zero for that. And in many ways, it makes this maybe the most important song on the album in terms of like the narrative of Björk as an artist, as a songwriter, as a musician. But yeah, so that's debut. That's debut. That is the first Björk album. And we'll be back again very soon with a discussion of the second Björk album post. So stick around for that. But first, let's rate this bad boy. I'm going to pick for my favorite tracks, Human Behavior, Venus is a Boy, and I'm going to put Come to Me in there as well over Crying, just to kind of like highlight that song because I really love that track. My least favorite, as I said, is Violently Happy, and yeah, it's a 6 out of 10. Morgan, who couldn't be with us, has given it a 7 and would like to share his love and enjoyment of this record as well.
My 3 favorite tracks definitely gotta be Venus is a Boy, Human Behavior, and I'll throw in the Anchor song. I think that's a really strong closer to the album. I think it's like a much needed kind of almost a breather, but it's still something that feels inextricably tied to the core of the album. I think it's really solid. And yeah, I also give it a 7. This is by no means, I think that some Björk fans might regard this a little bit better than we do, but I think it's undoubtedly an incredibly ambitious, even if comparatively modest start for Björk, and it's a successful one too. So it's going to be interesting to see where she goes from here and what we think about it.
Absolutely. So that is an average of 6.7 for Björk's debut. Let us know what you think of debut in the comments below. Let us know what you think of Björk, what your relationship to Björk is, how much she means to you as an artist. What albums are you looking forward to hearing us talk about in this series? We will be bringing in guests. We will be bringing in additional people to talk about these albums as well. It won't just be me and Jake the whole way through. So you have plenty to look forward to, and we're really excited to continue this journey and go deeper into this really exciting world. But yeah, we want to hear from you as well. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. Please subscribe to the channel if you have not already, especially if you are interested in hearing more of this Björk retrospective. Make sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss future episodes. Hit the bell as well if you want to get notified too. That also means a lot to us. If you want to support us even further, you can hit the join button. And for just $1 a month, you can support the channel and get yourself entitled to particular perks, such as having your name put at the title crawl of every video on this channel, plus also getting priority comment response. And if you want to recommend a record for us to listen to, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. But as always, folks, until next time, rock over London, Rock On Chicago, easy, breezy, beautiful cover girl.